All right, so today we're diving into a really tough case.
Yeah.
The life of Elliot Rodger and the Isla Vista killings back in 2014.
Right.
We've got a pretty in-depth document here laying out his whole life, the events leading up to that awful day and, the aftermath, the legacy.
Yeah.
Our goal today is to try to extract the most important insights from all this material to understand, the complexities of this event.
Absolutely.
And we're going to be doing that by sticking to the information we have right here in front of us,
Uh,
exploring Elliot Rodger's background, the motivations that he described himself, the timeline of how his grievances kind of escalated over time,
right.
and the disturbing legacy that his actions left behind.
Yeah, this is a really detailed account of Elliot Rodger's life that we have, and it's our primary source for this deep dive.
Okay.
So our goal is to really navigate this information
Mm.
and to pinpoint the key factors that contributed to this tragedy
Yeah,
based solely on what's presented to us in this document.
exactly.
But we want to highlight the most important points for you to give you a clear understanding of this case, as unsettling as it is.
So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Elliot Rodger was born in London, England on July 24th, 1991.
Okay.
His parents were connected to the world of filmmaking. His father, Peter Rodger, was a British filmmaker who even worked on The Hunger Games
Ah.
as a second unit director, which is
Mm.
someone who directs, kind of like supplementary filming.
Right.
His mother, Ong Lee Chintai, who is of Malaysian Chinese heritage, also worked in film, but she was an on-set nurse
Oh, wow.
for some pretty big movies like The Princess Bride and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade.
Wow. Interesting.
And there's even a connection to World War II because his paternal grandfather, George Rodger, was a photojournalist who was known for his powerful images from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp.
So a family with a lot of creative and historically significant ties.
Yeah.
And, it's striking. Right from the beginning, we see this contrast, a seemingly privileged background.
Yeah.
But then as we delve deeper into the material, we see significant difficulties that emerged later in Rodger's life.
Yeah.
So, he had a very affluent childhood early on in Sussex, England.
Right.
Before the family moved to Woodland Hills in Los Angeles when he was around 5 years old.
Yeah.
He went to private schools initially, like Dorset House School, which was an all-boys school, then Pinecrest Schools and Topanga Elementary School.
Right.
And, this kind of sets a foundation that doesn't immediately suggest the deeply troubled path that he would eventually take.
Yeah. And then a pretty significant change happens in his family life.
Okay.
His parents divorce when he's 7 years old. Custody is split, and then a year later, his father remarries.
Oh, wow.
A woman named Soumaya Akaboun, who was a Moroccan-born French actress.
Okay.
And it seems like around this time, we start to see some early signs of social difficulties emerging.
Okay.
The document describes him as being a very quiet and withdrawn young student
Right?
who had some struggles with speech. He preferred writing as a way to express himself.
Okay.
And he tended to avoid interacting with other kids. And there are some mentions of repetitive behaviors, him being easily overwhelmed
Hmm.
and experiencing anxiety in social situations. There's even an example of a time at Disneyland
Oh, wow.
where the crowds just became so overwhelming for him that he was brought to tears.
Wow. So even in a place that's supposed to be, fun and exciting
Right.
for a child, he's experiencing these really intense negative emotions.
Yeah, he's having trouble coping, and it's also noted that he saw his younger sister as a rival,
Okay.
which suggests that even early on, there might have been some complexities in his family relationships as well.
Yeah. So these early signs, they're really informative. The
Sure.
document emphasizes these social challenges,
Yeah.
that he had this quiet nature, his preference for writing over speaking, and, his avoidance of his peers, that detail about Disneyland.
Right.
It just really illustrates how sensitive he was to social situations.
Yeah.
And the fact that he saw his sister as a rival also suggests that there might have been some early difficulties within his family relationships as well.
And then the picture of his early development gets a bit more complicated because in 1999, when he's around 8 years old, his mother files an affidavit describing him as a high-functioning autistic child with special needs.
Okay.
And this was part of a request for increased child support.
Right.
Now, back then, the term high-functioning autistic child was often used to refer to individuals with autism who had strong verbal skills,
Right.
but still face significant challenges in social situations.
Right.
However, his father presented a diagnosis from a different doctor who disputed the autism label
Okay.
and instead suggested that conditions like depression and anxiety might have been overlooked. And this diagnosis recommended that Elliot have a psychiatric evaluation.
So there's a difference in opinion regarding his diagnosis early on.
Exactly. And that's something important to note.
Yeah, it is.
Because it kind of highlights the complexities and challenges in trying to understand someone's behavior, especially at such a young age.
Right. And this discrepancy in the initial assessments is really important because the fact that his father presented an alternative diagnosis
Yeah.
that included depression and anxiety, and that there was a recommendation for a child psychiatric evaluation
Right.
suggests that even at a young age, there were some recognized mental health concerns,
Right.
even if there wasn't a clear agreement on the specific diagnostic label.
Exactly.
And the document also mentions that he had a difficult relationship with his stepmother,
Oh.
whose parental authority he reportedly rejected. And so, that would have added another layer of complexity to his family life.
Right, absolutely. As he gets older, he becomes increasingly self-conscious about his height and his build. And he even tries playing basketball for a while,
Really?
hoping that it would help him to grow taller.
Wow.
He also feels embarrassed about his mixed-race heritage
Okay.
and believes that it sets him apart from others. So this kind of shows a growing awareness of how other people perceive him
Right.
and this sort of developing sense of, not quite fitting in.
Yeah, these details about his self-consciousness regarding his physical attributes and his feelings about his mixed-race heritage,
Yeah.
they really just highlight this increasing sensitivity that he had about how he saw himself in comparison to others.
Right.
And the sense of feeling different or set apart, it seems to have been a recurring theme throughout his development.
Yeah, and then as he moves into his middle school years, the document notes that he does try to overcome this social awkwardness through activities like skateboarding and, trying to approach girls.
Right.
But these efforts often lead to feelings of resentment.
Okay.
And he really develops this conviction that his life is fundamentally unfair,
Wow.
especially when he compares himself to his peers.
Right.
And this increasing difficulty in forming friendships, especially with girls, it just leads to more isolation and more frustration.
So it's like every time he tries to reach out, it just pushes him back further into that isolation.
Yeah, and it seems like every failed social interaction just reinforces that negative self-image and this belief that the world is against him.
This period really does seem to be a turning point where his internal struggles begin to really manifest as resentment that's directed towards others.
Right.
And the document explicitly mentions his feelings that life is unfair. And this is especially pronounced when he compares himself to the people around him.
Yeah.
And this increasing isolation, coupled with that specific frustration that he felt about relationships with women,
Yeah.
appear to be critical factors in how his grievances escalated over time.
Absolutely.
It's not just that he was isolated, but his attempts to break free from that isolation seemed to backfire, which leads to even greater resentment.
Exactly.
And it seems like every time he tries to connect with someone, it just reinforces those negative feelings.
Right.
And that belief that the world is against him.
Yeah, and then there's this really interesting detail about his mother actually dating George Lucas in the late 1990s.
Oh, wow.
So this leads to him being invited to some pretty high-profile events.
Oh, wow.
Like the red carpet premiere of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
Wow. However, his enjoyment of these events apparently starts to decrease because he feels uncomfortable being around couples.
Oh, wow.
And his half brother is also born during this time.
So even surrounded by this, seemingly glamorous world,
Right.
he's still struggling with those underlying anxieties and that social discomfort.
Exactly.
And, the birth of a half-brother could have also introduced some complexities into the family dynamic
Right.
and, how he saw his own place within that family structure.
Yeah, and then as he gets into middle school, his social activity decreases even further.
Okay.
And he really gets deeply involved in video games like Halo and World of Warcraft.
Okay.
And most of his social interactions start to happen online.
Right.
And there's also this really disturbing incident that's mentioned where when he's 11 years old,
Oh, wow.
he receives sexually explicit images in an AOL chat room.
Wow.
And this causes him significant distress.
That's really disturbing.
It is, and it really highlights the potential dangers of, unmonitored online spaces for children especially. Right, and the impact that exposure to inappropriate content at such a young age can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when he hits puberty, he develops a high sex drive,
Okay.
but at the same time, he develops this belief that he will never actually have sexual relationships.
Wow.
So he's experiencing this conflict, this drive for intimacy, but coupled with the belief that it's unattainable.
And that must have created a huge amount of internal tension.
Yeah, it really does. And then he's known as this quiet and weird kid by his peers.
Okay.
And sometimes he would intentionally annoy his classmates, which
Oh.
leads to bullying. And one bully in particular is a blonde girl. And the source material specifically mentions that he later claims that this experience contributed to the development of his misogynistic attitudes.
That's a really crucial point because we see this early connection between his negative experiences
Right.
and his later really disturbing views about women.
Exactly. The development of this high sex drive with the belief that he'll never have intimacy, it seems to have created this major internal conflict for him.
Yeah.
And the bullying, particularly him claiming that this experience with the blonde girl contributed to his later hatred of women, it really suggests these early roots of that really troubling aspect of his thinking.
Absolutely. That's a really key insight into the potential origins of those later views.
Yeah, and then high school seems to have been a really difficult time for him.
Okay.
He enrolls in Crespi Carmelite High School,
Okay.
which is an all-boys Catholic school.
Right.
And he actually has an anxiety attack on his very first day there just from being around the older and taller students.
Wow.
And he reports being severely bullied by some of the seniors there.
Oh, no.
And this includes being taped to his desk, being pushed into lockers, and even being subjected to homophobic abuse, apparently, because he didn't socialize with girls.
Wow, that's awful.
It's terrible, and it really does sound traumatic.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise that he starts to withdraw socially.
Yeah.
He neglects his homework. He spends excessive amounts of time playing video games.
So the bullying is really exacerbating those pre-existing anxieties and his social isolation.
Yeah, those experiences at Crespi High School
Right.
really do sound deeply traumatic.
Yeah.
All the details in the document about the bullying that he endures
Right.
would undoubtedly have made his existing social anxieties and feelings of isolation even worse.
Right. And this period really seems to have had a profoundly negative impact on his overall well-being.
Yeah,
And it just further contributed to his social withdrawal.
exactly. And then there's this really disturbing incident mentioned towards the end of his freshman year involving a classmate who was talking about a sexual encounter.
Okay.
And this apparently triggers a very strong negative reaction in Elliot.
Wow. So it's like these topics of intimacy and relationships
Yeah,
are just constantly reminding him of what he feels he's lacking,
exactly.
and it's causing him a lot of pain.
So his parents decide to move him to William Howard Taft Charter High School.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the large student body there intensifies his fears. And he ends up facing severe bullying once again.
Wow.
This leads to another anxiety attack, and he's withdrawn from Taft after only about a week.
So he can't seem to escape this cycle of bullying and social anxiety.
No, it seems like every time they try to put him in a new environment, hoping that things will get better,
Right.
it just seems to backfire.
Yeah, these repeated negative social experiences in different school environments, they really highlight just how much difficulty he had in trying to navigate those typical teenage social dynamics.
Right,
And that incident with the classmate talking about the sexual encounter,
right.
it seems to have been particularly triggering for him, which suggests that this sensitivity to these topics of intimacy and relationships that he felt excluded from
Yeah.
was really starting to take root.
Yeah.
And that rapid withdrawal from Taft after experiencing bullying again,
Right.
it really illustrates his inability to cope with these types of situations.
Yeah. So he's transferred yet again, this time to Independence Continuation High School, which was a smaller school that had shorter instruction hours.
Okay.
And at the age of 14, he receives a diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is often shortened to PDD-NOS. And this is a condition that falls on the autism spectrum,
Okay.
and it involves challenges with social interaction and communication.
Right.
And this diagnosis allows him to access special education resources.
Okay.
Then at 15, he's prescribed Xanax and Prozac,
Okay.
but he stops taking these medications after about a year.
Hmm.
Later, he's prescribed Paxil, but reports feeling drowsy while taking it, and he eventually claims that he relies on his mind and positive thinking to manage his social anxiety.
Interesting. So it seems like his engagement with professional mental health support,
Yeah.
it's a little bit complicated and perhaps inconsistent.
Yeah, that diagnosis of PDD-NOS at 14, it seems like an important piece of the puzzle
Yeah.
because it formally recognizes these challenges that he's having in his social development.
Right.
While it wasn't a diagnosis of autism itself, placing him on that spectrum likely informed the resources that he received,
Right.
but then his subsequent experience with the various medications,
Right.
and then eventually saying that he's relying on mind and positive thinking.
Right.
to manage his anxiety, it does suggest this really complex and perhaps not entirely consistent engagement with mental health support.
Yeah, it raises some questions about how effective those interventions were and whether or not he actually adhered to them.
Right, and then the document mentions that he has a temper tantrum at age 17 over a planned family trip to Morocco.
Oh,
And he does end up going on the trip,
okay.
but he remains unhappy while he's there, and he ends up returning home early.
Okay.
And around this time, his father's career in filmmaking experiences a significant downturn.
Okay.
And this has a knock-on effect on the family's finances.
Oh, wow.
And it even leads to a temporary pause in child support payments.
So there's this financial instability that's introduced into the family.
Right. And this incident in Morocco, it seems to highlight his continued difficulty
Right.
in adapting to new situations.
Yeah.
And perhaps even a reliance on his mother for that comfort and support.
Okay.
And then that decline in his father's career and the resulting financial strain,
Right.
it could also have contributed to feelings of instability or even resentment.
Right, because later on the document does mention him blaming his parents for not being wealthy.
Exactly. And that's a pretty crucial point because it suggests this growing sense of entitlement
Yes.
that might be clashing with this perceived lack of success that he's seeing around him.
Right. It seems like he's looking outward and blaming external factors for his internal struggles.
Exactly. And then after high school, he does start attending classes more regularly at Independence Continuation High School.
Okay.
And he actually graduates early in 2010.
Wow.
But by the time he turns 18, he's stopped all of his mental health treatment and he's no longer taking any medication.
Wow. So he's really rejecting any kind of professional support.
Yeah. And he's even blaming his parents for his own lack of wealth.
Okay.
He enrolls at Los Angeles Pierce College, but he drops out
Why?
because he's so upset by seeing happy couples there.
Oh, wow.
And he spends a lot of time wandering around or reading in bookstores, hoping to meet people and make friends. And he's later found just sitting alone in cafes with that same hope.
Wow. So he's clearly looking for connection,
Yeah.
but he's also struggling with those intense feelings of isolation and loneliness.
Exactly. When his parents offer to help him find work, he considers their suggestions to be beneath him.
Oh, wow.
Though he does briefly work in construction through a connection of his father's.
Good.
And he's
Yeah.
noted as being envious of his half-brother's sociability,
Okay.
but he does enjoy his company.
So there's this mixed dynamic there.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
really paints a picture of someone who is incredibly isolated socially
Yeah.
and who has a really strong sense of entitlement. You know,
Right.
his rejection of his parents' attempts to help him find work. And this envy of his half-brother's social ease,
Yeah.
it really suggests this disconnect from practical realities
Right.
and this focus on, his own perceived inadequacies
Yeah.
and then the successes of others.
It's like he's comparing himself constantly
Yeah,
and finding himself wanting.
right.
And his brief time at Pierce College,
Yeah,
the fact that he drops out simply because he sees happy couples
I know.
really emphasizes how sensitive he was to those relationships that he so desperately wanted but felt excluded from.
Exactly. So then he enrolls at Moore Park College.
Okay.
And he specifically states that he's hoping to meet blonde women there.
Okay.
And he continues to experience feelings of loneliness and unhappiness and this really intense envy of a couple that he sees in one of his classes.
Wow.
And his social anxiety is actually made worse by just being called upon in class.
Oh, wow.
So he ends up dropping out after just 1 year.
It seems like he keeps setting himself up for disappointment
Right.
by going into these environments with very specific expectations
Ex-
about who he wants to meet and what he wants to achieve.
And those expectations are unrealistic.
Right. And his move to Moore Park College with this specific intention of meeting a certain type of woman,
Yeah.
it really highlights how he's developing this narrow and objectifying view of potential partners.
Exactly.
And then those continued feelings of loneliness and unhappiness and envy, coupled with the impact of his social anxiety in that setting,
Yeah.
unfortunately leads to another unsuccessful attempt to integrate into a college environment.
And this leads him to his later life after he moves to Santa Barbara.
Okay.
His move to Isla Vista is motivated by this hope of finally getting a girlfriend and losing his virginity.
So he's moving with a very specific and ultimately unrealistic expectation.
Exactly. And when he gets to Isla Vista, he becomes incredibly angry when one of his roommate's black friends mentions losing his virginity at 13.
Wow.
And Rodger actually calls his mother to complain about the attention that he believes that black men are getting from blonde women.
Mm-hmm.
And he has so much trouble forming any kind of positive relationship with his roommates.
Oh, wow.
He uses racial slurs towards his Hispanic roommates, and he frequently tells them that he believes that he's better looking than they are. He even tells another roommate who is happy in a relationship with a girl that Rodger considers to be ugly.
Right.
That his roommate is foolish for being with her.
Wow.
And this roommate is actually so fearful for his safety
Oh, wow.
that he ends up requesting a new housing assignment.
It's really concerning.
It is, and he describes Rodger as having huge psychological issues and as being a ticking time bomb.
So the people around him are recognizing
Yeah.
that there's something seriously wrong.
Right, and it's really tragic that that observation
Right.
didn't lead to any kind of effective intervention.
Right. It's a really stark illustration of his escalating hostility
Yeah.
and how apparent it was to those in close proximity to them.
Exactly. This move to Isla Vista, it seems to amplify his existing resentments. And it really brings out some deeply troubling racist attitudes.
Yeah, the anger at his roommate's friend's experience,
Right?
the racial slurs towards his other roommates, his derogatory comments about another roommate's girlfriend.
Yeah.
It all points to this severely distorted view of social interactions, race, and women.
And that roommate's description of him as a ticking time bomb is tragically accurate.
It really is.
So he develops this deep hatred towards the people living in Isla Vista.
Oh, okay.
He sees himself as being much more sophisticated than them, and he believes that he's deserving of these relationships with attractive blonde women.
Right.
And he blames his rejections squarely on the women themselves
Wow.
and on the men that he sees as being more successful than him.
So he's externalizing all of his problems.
Yeah.
He's not taking any responsibility for his own actions or his own behavior.
Yeah, he's not looking inward at all.
Right. It's always someone else's fault.
And he even starts to have thoughts about killing couples.
Oh, wow.
And then in July of 2011, there are these two disturbing incidents.
Okay. Where he throws coffee at a kissing couple at a Starbucks.
Oh.
And then he splashes another couple with iced tea
Wow.
at a food court.
So his anger and frustration are starting to spill out into public acts.
Exactly. These incidents really do mark an escalation in his outward behavior.
Yeah.
He's now directly targeting individuals who are engaging in the very types of relationships that he feels he's being denied.
Right. And it shows this complete lack of control over his emotions.
Yeah, throwing coffee and iced tea at these couples, it might seem minor in isolation,
Right.
but it demonstrates this growing inability to manage his envy and resentment.
Right. And it's leading to these really hostile and inappropriate actions.
Yeah, he also drops a sociology course at Santa Barbara City College
SBCC.
simply because he sees a blonde woman in the class with her boyfriend.
Wow. So he can't even handle being in the same room as a
Nada.
couple.
These actions really illustrate how his internal rage is starting to translate into external acts of aggression. Exactly. And even though these acts might seem relatively minor, they're really a sign of something much darker brewing beneath the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in January of 2012, he splashes two blonde women at a bus stop with a latte just because they don't return his smile.
So he's escalating the aggression.
Yeah.
And his sense of entitlement is just completely out of control.
Yeah, he feels like he's owed something
Right?
from these women, and when they don't give it to him, he lashes out.
And it shows a total disconnect from reality
Right.
in terms of how social interactions actually work.
Yeah, he's got this really distorted view of how the world should operate,
Right?
and it's not matching up to what he's actually experiencing.
Exactly. And that's leading to these increasingly disturbing behaviors.
Yeah. And he would apparently roam around Isla Vista on a daily basis, and he would often position himself outside of this Domino's pizza,
Really?
hoping that a woman would approach him.
Wow.
He does manage to make one friend who tries to integrate him into their social circle.
Okay, so there's at least some attempt at connection there.
Right.
Some attempt to kind of bring him into a social group.
But by February of 2012, he's withdrawn from all of his classes at SBC
Wow.
because he's so frustrated with these social interactions, particularly with women.
So he's giving up.
He is, and it's around this time that he starts to seriously contemplate his day of retribution.
So this is a crucial moment where
Yeah.
he's withdrawing from the world
Right.
and retreating into this fantasy of revenge.
Exactly. And his actions of splashing those women with a latte
Right.
simply because they didn't smile back at him.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of this disconnect between his expectations of how people should behave
Right.
and reality.
He's got this idea in his head
Yeah.
that he's entitled to attention and positive responses from women.
Right.
And when he doesn't get it, he feels justified in lashing out.
Exactly. And his daily attempts to, try and solicit attention from women, and his eventual withdrawal from classes, which really coincides with the beginning of his planning for this violent retribution.
Right.
It really paints a picture of his rapidly deteriorating mental state.
Yeah, it's a clear sign that things are getting worse.
Yeah.
And that his fixation on these perceived social failures is becoming increasingly dangerous.
Exactly. And then despite these really dark thoughts that are clearly forming,
Right.
there are still moments where he engages with his family,
Okay.
at least outwardly.
Okay.
He attends a Katy Perry concert and the premiere of The Hunger Games in March of 2012 with his family.
So there are these moments where he's still trying to maintain a connection with his family.
Right.
But at the same time, his internal world is becoming consumed by resentment and these violent fantasies.
Right. And he's also developed this belief that the only way he could ever get a girlfriend is if he becomes rich.
Wow.
So in June of 2012, he buys lottery tickets,
Real-
hoping to win big, but he doesn't. And following that disappointment, he starts actively saving money for his planned attack.
Wow. So he's really committed to this idea
Yeah.
of carrying out this act of violence.
And he manages to save about $6,000.
That's a lot of money,
It is.
especially for someone his age.
Yeah. So this attendance at the family events, it shows that he still had some level of connection with them.
Yeah.
But underneath that, his internal world is becoming more and more dominated by these violent fantasies.
Right.
And this fixation on wealth as being this magic solution
Right.
to his romantic problems. Followed by this deliberate saving of money for this attack, it really reveals this disturbing and misguided sense of how he thought he could gain control over his situation.
Yeah, it's like he thinks that if he could just achieve this external success,
Right.
that it will somehow solve all of his internal problems.
Exactly.
And that's just not how it works.
And then in July of 2012, he becomes incredibly envious
Oh, no.
of these college students that he sees playing kickball in a park. And he's particularly triggered by seeing these blonde women interacting with the men.
So it's that same trigger again?
Yeah, it's like a recurring theme.
Right.
He goes out and buys a super soaker water gun, fills it with orange juice, and then he yells at and sprays these students.
Wow. So he's actually physically assaulting people now.
Yeah.
Over this perceived injustice.
And then in August of that same year, his father gives him a copy of The Secret,
Okay.
which is that self-help book that promotes this idea that you can attract positive outcomes into your life.
The law of attraction.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Rodger then spends a month meditating
Wow.
and trying to visualize himself in a relationship with a beautiful woman.
So he's trying to use this self-help philosophy
Right,
to
yeah.
achieve this very specific and ultimately unhealthy goal.
Exactly. He's not really trying to address his underlying social and psychological issues.
Right.
He's just focused on this one outcome.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to manifest a girlfriend
Exactly.
without actually doing any of the work.
Right. And then in September of 2012, he actually breaks his laptop in a fit of rage
Wow.
after he fails to win a $120 million Mega Millions lottery jackpot.
Oh, no.
And the very next day, he goes to a shooting range.
Wow.
And he starts to believe that his day of retribution is now actually possible.
So this is a huge turning point.
Yeah.
Where he's connecting this external failure
Right.
with the possibility of enacting violence.
Exactly. And then in November, he drives all the way to Arizona, not just once, but 4 times,
Wow.
to buy tickets for a $500 million Powerball jackpot.
And he doesn't win.
No. And this failure just fuels his anger even further.
Of course.
And it's at this point that he really starts to actively prepare for his attack in Isla Vista.
Wow.
And by December of 2012, he's purchased his first firearm, a Glock 34 long slide semi-automatic pistol.
So he's now armed.
Yeah, this is a really significant escalation towards violence.
It is.
The rage over losing the lottery.
Yeah.